So in the human body, how many intervertebral discs are there? How many vertebrae are there? How many nerves are there? In this video, we're going to be talking about that coming up. Hey guys, Aaron here with MPC Alternative TV, giving you the safest and fastest tips to alternative medicine using manual therapy. And today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. But before we start, go ahead and subscribe. The more you like my videos, the more content I'm going to put out for you guys. So today we're going to be talking about how many vertebrae, intervertebral discs, and nerves are there in the body. Now you might be saying, okay, that's kind of boring, but believe it or not, I'm studying this doctorate in chiropractic, and there's a whole bunch of physician's assistant, a lot of physical therapists, and many people get this confused, because if you think about it, how many vertebrae out there, okay, and how many vertebrae out there, or how many nerves are out there, how many intervertebral discs, and as manual therapists, right, you want to know what you're touching, what segment you're on, to be able to apply the safest and fastest and the most beneficial therapy modalities money can buy, and so you can help that person that's in need, okay? So let's get started and let's get a little closer. All right, so now we're going to start talking about the vertebral column. And in order for us to know where we're at or what segment we're on when we're applying manual therapy, we want to know where we're at. And you might say, okay, there's a lot of vertebral columns, but one thing that we must know is that the cranium is the skull is sitting on top of the spinal column. But we want to know their names, right? Now you might say, okay, not only do I want to know their names, but what are their numbers? How many are there? And we're going to get to that in just a sec. But first, the first segment is called the cervical region. The second part is the thoracic region. And this segment right here is called lumbar. And last but not least, the spinal column, or the vertebral column sits in what's called the sacrum. This is an A, by the way. And that last little bone, very small, is called the coccyx. Now, one thing you want to know about and how to name them, you want to say, you don't want to count, you just want to remember something very simple, and it's called breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, why breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What time do we eat breakfast? We eat breakfast at 7, right? So that means that there's 7 vertebral columns. There's 7 cervical vertebrae. And what are their names? So we identify each vertebra. Remember, the first one is the skull is sitting on top of the first vertebra. What's its name? We give it name C1. Why C1? Because C for cervical, and 1 because it's the first one, right? And this one has a very special name. It's called Atlas. Now, why Atlas? Why that name? In Greek mythology, right? That character was known to be the one carrying the world in his shoulders, right? And when we talk about, the skull is acting like the world, right? The planet. And C1 is the one literally carrying it on top. So we give it that name, C1. And the second vertebra, C2, we give the name axis. Now, why axis? Because literally the atlas sits on top of C2, or second name axis, because it rotates on its axis. That's it. Don't get it too complicated. Just know that if you hear atlas, it's referring to C1, and if you hear axis, it's referring to C2. Now, there's more to these two vertebrae. They're very special, right? Even though they form part of the cervical, they're kind of different. And remember, we're just touching the basics. We're touching the outer layer, and little by little, with other videos I'm going to put out there, we're going to get deeper and deeper, okay? But just know that when we're referring with these names, we're actually referring to these numbers. C1, C2, right? C3, C4, C5, C6, C7. That's it. No more complicated. Now, when we talk about the thoracic region, what time do we eat lunch? Remember, breakfast 7, lunch at 12. The thoracics, T1, T for thoracics, 1 because it's the first segment, and then T2, T3, T4, and we go all the way down. Last one, T12. That's it. Breakfast, 7, lunch at 12. Now, dinner. Most people, they can eat at 10 o'clock at night, but when we're talking about this, we eat lunch at 5. Okay? 5. So it's L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. That's simple. Okay, now, the sacrum is just, it's a bone. So the spinal column, the vertebral column, is sitting on top of the sacrum, right? So when we're born with 5 bones, 5 sacral bones that compose the sacrum. And as we start getting grown, we start developing, they fuse together, they join. So just know that this is just one bone, right? But it's composed of 5 bones at birth. That's it. It's just one bone. But if you want to get a little bit more specific, it fuses 5 bones into one. And that happens, I don't know, I can't give you the day. It could be like a year or 2. I really don't know right now. Now, for coccyx, it's the same. When we're born, we have 4 small little bones, but at the end, it's this one little tiny bone that forms. Okay? So, we talk about cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. Okay, now we're going to be talking about intervertebral disc. Now, the interesting thing about it is that when we talk about, if you think about it, the cranium sits on top of C1. So if there's a disc, right, a disc, it can't really move. It won't move. Because remember, C1 gives the ability to move. That's what it does. That's what the atlas does. That's what C1 does. And if there's a disc between that space, we can't really do that much. But the space, this space right here, right? This space right here, we also give it a name C0. But not only that, there's no disc, right? So right here, I'm going to put a little arrow right there. There is no disc. Now, if you think about it as well, when we're referring to atlas and axis, which also means C1 or C2, the atlas or C1 is moving on top, right? It's moving on top of C2, C1 on C2, but it can't move if it has a disc as well. That's because between C1 right here, okay, I'm pointing, between C1 and C2, there is no disc. And this space right here that you see right here closed out, and this right here, those are discs all the way down, as well as here, okay? So just know that between C1 and C2, there is no vertebral disc, okay? Now, you might say, where does the disc begin? The disc between here, between C2 and C3. But you might think, okay, so that's between C2 and C3, we give the name C1 intervertebral disc. And that is absolute no, okay? Between C2 and C3, we're going to give the name of the segment above, which is above. So think about it. If C2 is on C3, the segment above is C2. And what are we going to give that name? We're going to give that name C2. Not C1. No, not C1. The name is C2. And now if we move on between C3 and C4, this vertebral disc, this one right here, what name are we going to give it? Remember, the segment above, C4. I'm sorry, I apologize. Not C4, segment above, C3. Okay? Now between C4 and C5, this intervertebral disc, we're going to give it the name C4 intervertebral disc. Normally, the abbreviations, because it's a long name, it's given IVD, intervertebral discs. And that goes through all the way down here. Okay? C5 on C6, C5, IVD. Because you might say, okay, but why do I have to put IVD? Because you can say C5 what? You have to be very specific. C5 vertebra or C5 disc. So that's why we put IVD. Okay? C6 on C7, C6, C7 on C7. Okay, so this is when we transition. We go from cervical to thoracic region, right? So we go from C7 to T1. And what tends to happen, you might get a little confused, it's the same concept. Between C7 and T1, we give the name C7. When we transition from T1 to T2, it's T1, T2 to T3, right? T2, and it applies throughout the same, all the way down, all the way through the whole entire, until we hit the lumbar region. Okay, so when we hit to this segment, so remember, it applies to every single segment. When we get to L5, to the sacrum, it's still L5 IVD, intervertebral disc. That's it, because it's the segment above. Okay, and if we wish to the sacrum, it's sacrum disc, but we really don't take that much into account, but just know that there's a disc between them. What else I was going to say? So yeah, so remember, between the cranium and C1 or C0, there's no intervertebral disc. C1 and C2, there is no intervertebral disc. The first intervertebral disc, right, is C2, C3, but it's not C1, it's C2. Okay, and that tends to happen throughout right here. You might say, okay, but why didn't you do it right here? Is it not important? Or right here? Yes, the same concept that applies here in the cervical region applies all the way down that we've been talking throughout right here, except for these spaces. Okay, now that we talked about now that you know, or now that we know how many vertebrae there are, how many intervertebral discs there are, and how to name them, now let's start talking about the amount of nerves. Now that we talked about the amount of vertebrae that there are, the amount of intervertebral discs that there are, now we're going to be talking about the nerves. But how many vertebrae are there exactly? So we numbered them, but we actually didn't, we numbered each and every one. So we gave them a name. We gave them C1, C2, we gave them, T1, T2, T3, T4, up to 12, and then lumbar. But how many vertebrae are there in general? So there's there are 24 in a normal human body. And when we talk about intervertebral discs, excluding, remember, between the cranium, the skulls, between C1 and C2, there are about 23 intervertebral discs. Now, the question is, how many nerves are there, right? Now, we know that there's no intervertebral disc between the skull and C1, but there is a nerve coming out. And that nerve, we give them a name of C1, right? But when we were talking about the intervertebral disc, we say that we always name them with the segment above, correct? But this time, only for the cervical region, because it changes when we hit the thoracic region and the lumbar region down. In the cervical region, we're going to give it the name of the segment below, okay? And in a few, you're going to understand why. So between C1 and C2, there is... we name it the segment below, it's going to be C2. Between C2, C3, 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 C4, the segment below will be C4. So we give this nerve C4, C4, C5, C5. Between C5 and C6, it's going to be C6 because the segment below. Between the segment C6 and C7, the segment below will be C7 of the vertebra. Remember, we're talking about the vertebra. That when I say segment, I'm talking about the segment of the vertebra. Okay, so the vertebra C6 and the vertebra C7, the segment below would be C7. Now, it would make sense that when we hit C7 and T1, we're going to give it the name T1 because it's the segment below. But it's weird because that's not how anatomy shows us. Anatomy tells us between C7 and T1, it goes from C7 to C8. Now, we're going to stop there very quick. Just because, try not to overthink it. And I know what you're thinking, okay, but why? Because there is no C8 vertebra. That's just how it is, and that's what anatomy tells us. Don't get too much inside your head. Just know that it goes to C1, C2, C3, up to C8, okay? And when we get to T1 and T2, it goes back to normal, okay? You might be saying, real quick, oh, Aaron, why is it that, you're giving it the color green? In the previous video, in the previous recording, the colors of the thoracic region was green. In anatomy books, we identify the nerves as the color yellow, okay? But since I don't have money, we're using green. So please bear with me. That's all I wanted to say about that. Now, let's go back. So remember, T1 and T2, we're going to give it the segment of the rule of the intervertebral disc of the segment above. So above T1 and T2 will be T1, right? T2, C3, the segment above will be T2. The segment of the vertebra of the thoracic region, T3 and T4, is going to be T3, T4 and T5, T4, and all the way down T5, T6, T7, T8, T9, T10, T11, T12. And then when we reach to the lumbar region, remember L1 and L2, the segment above would be L1, L2 vertebra, and L3 vertebra, the segment above will be L2, so we give it L2 nerve, L3, L4, L3, L4, L5, L4, L5 sacrum, L5. Now, this is the sacrum. We talked about it already. But within the sacrum, they have something called sacrum, the foramens of the sacrum. And coming out of these sacrums, coming out of these foramen, which is, what's that called? The name foramen means just hole. Okay? So when we what comes out of the foramen is a nerve. And the nerve is, we're going to give it the name S1. Why S1? S for sacrum. S2, S3, S4. And under this last foramen of S4 foramen, there's another nerve that comes out. And it's S5. And the coccyx, remember we talked about it, it has its own nerve, right? We call it CO coccyx 1. Okay? Now, remember that it's coming up on the left side, but it's also not only just on the left side, but on the right side. Don't think this is just one nerve. Why? Because there's 24 vertebras. There's 23 intervertebral discs, but there's 31 nerves, but not just 31 nerves. There's 31 pairs of nerves. I know you might say this is dumb. I knew that, but trust me, we get it confused. So if somebody asks you, is it 24 pairs of vertebras? No. Is it 23 pairs of vertebras? No. Is it 31 pairs of nerves? Yes. Is it 23 pairs of intervertebral discs? No. Okay? Now, this might look dumb, but trust me, a lot of people get confused. Okay? So let's just recap. How many vertebrae are there? There's 24. How many intervertebral discs are there? There's 23. How many pairs of nerves are there? There's 31. Okay? So now this is just the basics. I know that it might not look confusing, or it is confusing for some of you guys, so just go ahead and rewind the video and just get it down. This is pretty basic, but believe it or not, a lot of people get confused, and later on it starts getting more interesting. Remember, we're touching the outside, and then little by little we're going to start getting deeper and deeper, because believe it or not, all these nerves, or the majority of the nerves, start turning into what's called plexuses. For example, you have the cervical plexus, you have the brachial plexus, you have the lumbar plexus, and you have the sacrococcygeal plexus. Okay? And then they start to unite and start innervating all the bodily functions of our body, such as muscle, organs, etc. Thank you so much for listening to these videos. And don't forget to subscribe and like. The more you like my videos in MPC Alternative TV, giving you the safest and fastest tips to alternative medicine using manual therapy. But we also, you know, I would love to make more video content for you guys, okay? So, catch you next time.